So good morning, everyone. We have just had about 2 feet of snow hit us yesterday. So I hope everyone is warm and I'm assuming you have power if you're here because you're on Zoom, and that you didn't have any major ramifications from the storm. So welcome. I'm very excited to introduce Rabbanit Leah Herzog. Before I do that, a little bit about all the exciting things we have happening at Mayan right now, which are many. Next Sunday, we're going to be having our 929 Siyum with Rachel Danziger and Miriam Gedweiser. It's a really great opportunity to learn with two really wonderful teachers. Rachel will be speaking on Chronicles and the end of Tanakh, and Miriam will be speaking on Noach and sort of the circle of Tanakh as the 929 project gets started again. And we'd love to see you there. We have Rachel also teaching a class in February, and more details are on our website. We have a lot of really great programming coming up for Pesach, ahead of Pesach, so please be sure to go take a look. The other big announcement we have, of course, is our Emerging Scholar Fellowship, that we are now accepting applications for a female Orthodox teacher who's interested in mentorship and developing skills to teach adults. So if you would like more information about that, that's also available on our website, or you can contact me. We've already had a lot of interest in it, which is great, and I hope we can continue that momentum. So let me briefly introduce Rabbanit Leah Herzog. We're thrilled that she's joining us this morning to start off our Israeli speaker series for this winter. Rabbanit Herzog is an educator, writer, and psychologist who currently teaches at Matan and at Midrashet Amudim. She received her bachelor's degree in psychology from Barnard College and earned her teacher certification from Michlala, the Jerusalem College for Women. Before making Aliyah in 2019, she taught Tanakh and was the co-director of Israel Guidance at Mayanot Yeshiva High School for Girls and Teaneck. She now lives in Givat Ze'ev with her husband, and we are really thrilled to be welcoming her this morning. I will be putting the source sheet in the chat. You should have also received it by email, and I'm now going to turn things over to Rabbanit Herzog, so please enjoy.
Thank you so much, Zoe, and it's a pleasure, really a pleasure to meet you and everybody else here, and I echo Zoe's hope that everybody is warm and safe and dry and healthy and sane. Okay, so I'm just going to give you a little bit of a brief overview of the Shear, and I'm going to be screen sharing actually right now. Here we go. Also, just as an FYI, your eyes are not deceiving you. The source sheet is white print on a black background. I am pretty significantly visually impaired, and it's actually much easier for me to read it that way. I've also been told by a lot of students that it's easier to read that way. So just so you know, that's excuse me, that's not an optical illusion, that's actually real. The other thing is, because of my vision, I probably won't see a question that's in the chat. So if you have a question or something that you don't understand, please feel free to unmute yourself for a moment or so and ask the question. I want to make sure that everybody understands what I'm saying and where I'm going. And then at the end of the shiur, I'm going to stop. We're going to leave probably about 10 or 15 minutes at the end for questions, comments, and what have you. Okay, and without further ado, I'm going to put on my reading glasses so that I can read, and we're going to launch. My background, as Zoe mentioned, is psychology, which is what I was trained in. I have a master's in educational psychology. I also have a master's in educational leadership, and have 2 half doctorates, which unfortunately don't make a whole. But my passion is really Tanakh. And the mantra that I use in everything that I use, and everything that I do, and everything that I teach is a Mishnah from Pirkei Avot. Ben Bagbag Omer, Hafoch ba Hafoch ba Decholaba. Ben Bagbag says, turn it over and turn it over, for everything is in it. That idea that within Tanakh, within Torah, we really have all wisdom, and it's a matter of accessing it, understanding it, absorbing it. And that's really the perspective that I come with. I come also with a very, I guess, holistic type of perspective, an integrated perspective, that everything informs Torah and Torah informs everything, in particular psychology, but also history and archaeology and literature and political science and, kind of anything and everything that has to do with humans, physical sciences. So kind of it's just going to all be in the mix there. The specific topic for today that I'm going to discuss with everybody is Shaul HaMelech, is King Saul. King Saul is perhaps one of the most complex and absolute tragic figures in all of Tanakh. He actually really embodies that Greek concept of a perfect tragic hero, of someone who really is in many ways an extraordinary, outstanding human being, but also has this tragic flaw, and it is the tragic flaw that, as in all Greek tragedy, brings him down. In many ways, I feel that the stories, the chapters, everything having to do with Shaul, which really takes up a good part of Shmuel Aleph and into Shmuel Bet, mirrors a national tragedy on a microscopic scale. And it's also an incredibly human tragedy because it also talks about the relationship between the king and the Navi and the current king and the future king, and it on a tribal level and on a national level and on a personal level. So it's just kind of one big ball of yarn that actually has multiple threads. The more you try to unravel it, the more it kind of gets tangled, and then the more you can unravel it some more. I think I threw in enough metaphors there. So let's launch. The Shear today is really going to be looking at two driving questions. And the first part of the Shear is going to look at the first question. The second part is going to look at the second. And I've kind of, teased the questions out, but obviously these are really two questions that are intertwined. The first question is a theology. It's a theological question, the question of kingship. Do we need a king? Should we have a king? Isn't God our king? And then underscoring that is the theology of Shaul in particular, being King Shaul, who was not from Shevet Yehuda, from the tribe of Judah. We'll talk about that a little bit more. And then the second part of the Shear is going to be looking at the psychology of the king, psychology of leadership in general, which I'll just touch on, but really the psychology of Shaul, the individual, and looking at how his personal psyche was both what made him such an exemplar and such a potentially amazing king, and also then what led to his undoing. Just as a word, we're not going to get to those chapters later in Sefer Shmuel Aleph and into Shmuel Bet, where we really see Shaul unraveling as a person, as a psychological being, somebody who today probably would be diagnosed as bipolar, at the very least, perhaps paranoia disorder. And not to be flip, but just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you. And in Shaul's case, that was very much the case. But we're not going to go all the way there. We're going to kind of set the stage so that after today, if you want to go off and read those chapters, hopefully you'll be able to understand them in a new light. Okay, so we're going to start off the theological part with the theology of kingship. And the question is do we need a king? And as we go through the psukim, which I'm about to share with you, I'm going to be using Sefaria. If you have a Tanakh and you would like to be using your Tanakh, that's fine. I've got multiple Sefaria tabs open. So we're going to be looking at some of the text inside. The two questions that we should be looking at here is, what is the ambiguous meaning of the word V'amarta? That'll become clear in a second. And the ambiguity of the phrase Kechol HaGoyim. Without further ado, we're going to go to our first Sefaria tab here, which is Sefer Dvarim, Perek Yud Zayin, the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 17. Right? We know that Sefer Dvarim is the last of the 5 books of the Torah. It is the Sefer that is known as Torat Moshe. Likely Moshe is the author with Hashem's editorial stamp of approval. The bulk of Sefer Dvarim is dealing with the 40th year in the Midbar, Bnei Israel, the children of Israel, the Israelites, are poised to enter Eretz Israel. We're now the second generation. All of those who were supposed to have died off in the desert did. And Moshe is both reviewing, but also editorializing, giving both a pep talk and a musar shmuz to these people who are about to enter Eretz Israel. And there are things that show up in Sefer Devarim that don't show up earlier, and vice versa. And if this were a course in Sefer Devarim, we'd go into that. But here are the psukim about the king. When you come to the land, and these words, by the way, become very, very important in the story of Shaul becoming king. So you get to the land, and that Hashem has given you, you inherit it, meaning you vanquish all of the people that are living there at that point. You dwell in it, which means you establish yourself there permanently. Ve'amalta, okay, and please note the Sefaria translation here, settled it, and you decide, okay? I love Sefaria's translation. It is based on JPS 1985, but it's not what the word Ve'amarta actually means, right? Ve'amarta means you shall say. I'm translating it for the moment in the simplest form possible, right? You shall say, the vav here is the vav hipuch. It's the vav that changes a verb from the past tense into the future tense. The amarta is you say, so this is you will say. Asima alai melech, I will place upon myself a king, kechol hagoyim asher svivotai. Like all of the nations that are around me, again, I will set a king over me, as do all of the nations about me. Okay, and again, as do all of the nations about me is, again, not exactly a literal translation of the words. I will place upon me a king like all of the nations that are around me. Okay, now we have two major questions here that we need to address. One is grammatical and one is philosophical. The grammatical question is as follows. The word Ve'amarta can have two meanings. It can mean it's a mitzvah, right? You will say. In other words, this is something that once we get into the land, we as a people must do. Ergo, it is a mitzvah, it is a positive command to say these words, let me have a king like all of the nations that are around. That's option A. Option B, however, is Ve'amarta is and you will say, or should you say. In other words, in the event that you say, da 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 da. By the way, we have the same ambiguity in Shema when it says V'ahavta et Hashem Elokecha, right? That there's a huge machloket there, whether it is an actual mitzvah to love God, because if it is a mitzvah, we come again to the philosophical question, how can one love God, right? How can one be commanded an emotion? And at the end of the day, we've got two trains of thought. One is, yes, you can be commanded to love God. And two is, no, you can't be commanded to love God, but you can be commanded to behave in a way that is parallel to love, right? And even if you have to give up your life, that kind of devotion and dedication. We've got the same question here. Is it that you should say this? In other words, that this is a positive command. We're going to look at the Mefarshim in a minute, or it's an option. In other words, when you get to the land, should you say this, this, and this, then here's the response that you take to this. The second part of the question is this line here, or this phrase here at the end, which is, really begs the question, what do you mean, like all of the nations that are around, right? Since when do we phrase things to make ourselves like people around us? Quite the contrary, right? We have this whole concept of issues of what's known as chukot hagoyim, this kind of very ambiguous but still very much present concept that what the goyim do is specifically what we should not do. And the converse is that part of the brachot and the klalot, the blessings and the curses, is that when we are good, then Hashem will spare us all of the of the plagues and all of the illnesses that the Goyim had suffered. And when we are not good, it is those plagues and illnesses that will be visited upon us. In other words, our intersection with the Goyim is kind of a separate piece to borrow a title. But it certainly shouldn't be imitated, and this is very troubling. So let's jump into the Mefarshim here. Okay, we're going to go back to our source sheet. Actually, before we do, we're just going to go, right? Som tasim alecha melech, you shall put upon yourself a king, right? Again, and here we see where Sepharia is going, right? In the verse before, it says, and you decide, right? Sepharia here is clearly reading it as option B, right? Should you want a king? Goes on, you shall be free to set up king upon you, right? Whereas som tasim alecha melech, right, seems to sound much more like v'haya im shamoa tishma'u, right? Again, the question becomes, it's the same question, just a little bit more even, pulled out. If you say v'amarta is a mitzvah, then som tasim alecha melech, it is a mitzvah to put upon you a king, right? It's all one big mitzvah. Ask for a king, place upon yourself a king. On the other hand, if it is an option, then the Torah is saying, fine, do it, right? You may do it, go ahead and do it. However, that king should be Asher Yivchar Hashem Elokecha, right? Even if you feel that your desire to have a king is yours and it's an option, you need to know that the king has to be somebody that God chooses. He has to be Mikerav Achecha, meaning he has to be from Bnei Yisrael. Tasim alecha melech, lo tuchal latet alecha ish nachri. You can't have somebody who's not Jewish. Asher lo achicha hu, that he is not from your brethren, right? And then you have the special mitzvot of the king. Can't have too many horses, can't have too many wives, can't have too much money. And then you have the positive command that he has to have his own Sefer Torah that he takes with him all of the time. Okay, so that's the idea of the king in a nutshell. Let's go back to our source sheet now. We're going to look at the machloket. Sorry about that. Here we go. So we have a three-way machloket here, and the three-way machloket is actually based on the Tosefta in Masechet Sanhedrin, Daf Daled Amud Bet. So the Tosefta is the Mishnaic times, right? There are kind of three areas of Mishnaic writings. One are the Mishnah. The Mishnah make it into the Mishnah, which is edited by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi around 200 CE. The Mishnah and what goes into the Mishnah is approximately 1/10 of the written corpus that was out there. There are about 8,000 Mishnayot. Those were culled from 80,000 type of Tanaitic sayings that were out there. Those other 72,000 Tanaitic sayings are either Braitot or Toseftot. And Braitot tend to be halachic, and Toseftot tend to be Agadic and Midrashic. Although it's not a perfect breakdown, and many PhDs have been written about this, and but just kind of when you see something that's a Tosefta, you think that, okay, it's darshan, right? The Tosefta very often is explaining a pasuk. So Rabbi Yehuda Omer, we see that we have a three-way machloket in the Tosefta, right? We have a Rabbi Yehuda, we have a Nehorai, and we have a Rabbi Eliezer. Okay, so Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Rabbi Yehuda says, Shalosh mitzvot nitztavu Yisrael b'biatan la'aretz. The three commands, right, very clear. Rabbi Yehuda feels that this is a command. Three commands Bnei Yisrael were given when they come into the land. Nitztavu limlot lahem melech. Okay, they were commanded to appoint upon themselves a king. Shena Amar som tasim alecha melech. Right, and this is our quote from Sefer Dvarim, that Rabbi Yehuda understands this as a mitzvah, som tasim alecha melech. I'm not going to go into the rest of it right now, but livnot lahem beit bechira, to build a beit mikdash, and lahachrit, right, lahachrit zaro shel Amalek, right, and to wipe out the children of Amalek. And Shaul, in many ways, could have accomplished at the very least 2 out of these 3, perhaps even all 3. Rabbi Nehorai goes on and he says, Lo ne'emra parasha zo ela mipnei hatar om. This parasha, meaning this section here of Kitavo ela aretz, this was put in here to kind of forestall or allude to the complaining and fetching and arguing that was going to go on around the appointment of the king. Right? If we know the story, the Kitsur, in brief, the people come to Shmuel, they say, we want a king. Shmuel is very upset about the idea, very angry. God comes to him and says, don't be angry. They're not rebelling against you. They're rebelling against me. Give them a king, anoint them a king. And then God tells him that king is going to be Shaul. But we see throughout the early prakim of Sefer Shmuel that Shmuel is at best very, very ambivalent about the idea of a king. And in fact, in his last warning about a king in Perek Yud, he's basically foreshadowing everything that happens with Shlomo HaMelech, with King Shlomo, King Solomon. So Rabbi Nehorai said that this section here in Sefer Dvarim that we just did is put here to foreshadow or forestall the argument that's going to happen, right? Shena Amar, the Amarta Asima Alai Melech, right? Same thing that we just read, right? And you shall say, or if you say, put, give me a king, Keneged Tarmotam Taramotam Shel Yisrael, right? That this is foreshadowing this whole argument that is going to occur with Bnei Israel. So the Torah says, fine, if you're going to ask for a king, fine, have a king, but these are the rules of the king. So just again, to summarize, Rabbi Yehuda feels it's a mitzvah, and Rabbi Nehorai feels quite the opposite, that it does not seem to be a mitzvah, it just seems to be a solution to a problem that will arise in the future. Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Yossi Omer, Rabbi Eliezer, the son of Rabbi Yossi, says, Zekenim sha'alu kehalacha, the Zekenim asked for a leader appropriately, Shene Emar, Tana lanu melech l'shoftenu, right? That's in Shmot Perek Aleph Pasuk Chet. Aval amei haaretz chazru v'kilkilu Shene Emar v'hayinu gam anachnu kechol hagoyim. Right, and this is, by the way, this is a quote from Sefer Shmuel. So this touches on this idea of the kind of philosophy of a king. What does it mean to have a king like all of the other nations have? Is that an appropriate way to go about asking for a king or not? Okay, so going into the Mefarshim, we have a 3-way machloket, and I'm going to just touch on this machloket. The Rambam goes according to Rabbi Yehuda in his Hilchot Melachim, right? He has an entire section of the Yad HaChazakah, the entire section of his halachic work, right? The Mishneh Torah, that he says, Me'achar shehakamat melech mitzvah, right? This is completely unambiguous, since establishing a king, anointing a king is a mitzvah, Lama lo ratzah hakadosh baruch hu kisha'alu melech mishmuel, right? Since it's a mitzvah, why was God upset? Lefi shesha'alu b'tar omer, right? So in the Rambam here is in effect, he's kind of smushing together both Rabbi Yehuda's opinion in the Tosefta and Rabbi Nehorai's opinion in the Tosefta. Yes, having a king is a mitzvah, but you have to do it properly. You have to ask for a king properly. We're going to talk about in a minute what that means, right? V'lo sha'alu l'kayem et hamitzvah ela mipnei shekatzu b'Shmuel hanavi. Because what we see at the end of Perek Chet in Sefer Shmuel is that Shmuel was getting old, his sons were not going in his way, and the people got frustrated and irritated and said, okay, forget it, your sons are not going to be doing the job that you're doing, we want a king. Right? So it was, in the Rambam's view, it was appropriate for Shmuel to take it personally. So again, what the Rambam is saying here is that having a king is a mitzvah, but the way you go about asking for a king has to be appropriate. So let's go back into Sefer Dvarim for a second. We can read the Rambam very nicely in the words, right? Here we go. Ki tavo al haaretz, etc., etc. Ve'amarta, and you shall say, it is a mitzvah. Asima alai melech, I want a king. Kechol hagoyim asher svivotai. And what the Rambam does with these words, he does it both here in the Mishneh Torah and a later place. He also does it in Moreh Nevuchim. Is the way he reads it is, I want a king like all of the other nations have, right? All of the other nations have ambassadors, have political leaders, have a structure to represent them. I want that same structure, right? I need a seat at that diplomatic table. On the other hand, we understand, Som tasim alecha melech, asher yivchar Hashem elokecha bo. Right? That king has to be done in a way that's appropriate. And here's where the Rambam says this is where Bnei Yisrael went wrong. They didn't want to do it because it was a mitzvah. They wanted to do it because they were annoyed. Okay, let's go back now to the Ramban. Okay, now, the Ramban appears here. I brought it in English again, kind of for the sake of a little bit of equity for some people for whom English is easier than for Hebrew. So he gives, I'm giving you the Ramban here in the middle. The Ramban you can find also in Sefaria, but it is my further opinion that this is also one of Moshe's allusion to future events, right? The Ramban here is not really dealing with Rabbi Yehuda in the Mishnah, but in the Tosefta, but he's really focusing in on Rabbi Yehuda, right? And he's saying that what's this all about? It's when you get to Eretz Yisrael, if you should say, I want a king, then Som tasim alecha melech, and he says straight out, right? I want to be like all of the other nations. And why should the Torah say this in connection with a command, right? Because we know from Yirmiyahu that that's exactly not what we should be doing. Sorry if the English here is really bad, right? Envious again, but this is an allusion to what will be, right? The Ramban says that this is an allusion to what will be, and therefore this section is written in the intermediate tense and not in the form of a mitzvah. Now, I just want to take a step back for a second. The Ramban here is completely consistent with his basic approach, which is if Bnei Yisrael want something, they can have it, provided they do it in a way that Hashem wants for them. The best example of the Ramban's approach is by the Meraglim, is by sending the Meraglim, where it says, Shlach lecha anashim, right? Where it seems to be that Hashem is commanding Moshe to send Meraglim. It says in Sefer Dvarim, when Moshe is recounting the story, that you came to me and said, let us send spies or let us send men, says the Ramban when he's kind of resolving this issue. Yes, Bnei Yisrael came to Moshe with regard to the Meraglim, and then Moshe went to consult with God, and God said, okay, if they want to do it, they need to do it in a way that I am commanding. Right? If you want to do something, you have to do it because God has commanded it. It's the same thing here, right? And again, fits nicely into the words. Right? If you want a king, right? Ve'amarta, should you want a king, like Rabbi Naharai says, it's an allusion to what's going to happen in the future, then this is a mitzvah. Som tasim alecha melech. It becomes a mitzvah. It's been commandified. I know that's a really weird English word, but it works in this case. Okay, we're going to move on to the Abarbanel. And in order to understand the Abarbanel, we need to remember something historical that's extremely important. The Abarbanel was the chief economic advisor in the court of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain. Right? At the time, the most powerful, the wealthiest, the most gorgeous palace in all of Europe, most likely. The Abarbanel has a front row seat to monarchy and money, and what the impact of money and monarchy and power are, right? And again, it's the Abarbanel who historically we know begs and begs and begs the king and queen to not expel the Jews from Spain. And then Queen Isabella, a very devout Catholic, is convinced at the last minute by the Grand Inquisitor that the Jews are the agents of the devil, and that if she leaves the Jews in Spain, then her kingdom shall be damned. And at that point, she expels the Jews from Spain in 1492. And then shortly afterwards, the Jews are expelled from Portugal. And the Abarbanel spends kind of the rest and the end of his life wandering and extremely grief-stricken and sad. So he sees very much firsthand what monarchy, what power, what money brings. And he is extremely, extremely bitter about it, and really in many of his Parshanut warns very, very strongly against monarchy, against kingship, against kind of that centralization of power into the hands of one person, and basically believes that money truly is the root of all evil, something that goes back all the way to Gan Eden. So he says as follows, Som Tasim Alech HaMelech, right? Quote from this pasuk here, Lo sheyitzaveh bezeh et Yisrael sheyish'alu melech. This is not a mitzvah to anoint a king. He believes it's not a command. Ulefi zeh tihiyeh hamitzvah hazot tuluya b'devar hareshut. This mitzvah is like the whole framing of having a king is actually a reshut. It's actually something that is permissible, but it's not a command. When he says the word mitzvah here, he means it a little bit more loosely than the Rambam and the Ramban use it. Ka'asher tirtzeh la'asot, right? Im heyoto beli ra'ui. If you want to have a king, even though this is not an appropriate thing to do, al ta'asehu. Don't do it. He's saying straight out, don't do it. Ki im bazeh ha'ofen, the only way you can have a king is if you do it according to the strictest interpretation, right? Real strict constitutionalist, the strictest interpretation and the strictest adherence to Torah law. Vehu domeh gam ken the parasha, Sefer Dvarim, Perek Daled, right? Ki tolid banim ubenei banim. Look at the parasha that he chooses, and it is not coincidental, right? What he's saying is as follows. He's saying that this statement here in Sefer Dvarim, when it says, Ki tavo el haaretz, when you come to the land, okay, and you say asima alai melech. Okay? This whole coming to the land is obvious, right? But it's not necessarily a given. When I say it's obvious, I mean that this is talking about when we come to Eretz Yisrael. But it's not a given, says the Abarbanel, that we're going to get to Eretz Yisrael. We only get to Eretz Yisrael, Asher Hashem Elokecha noten lecha l'rishta. Right? Noten lecha v'rishta v'yishavta ba. This is not a simple process. Right? You have to get there, you have to inherit it, and you have to dwell in it. Right? All of that is literally by the grace of God. It's not a foregone conclusion. And if you get to the land and you say this, this, and this, then you can do this, this, and this. But in the thing that the Abarbanel here is quoting in his proof text, we recognize this proof text. This proof text is what we read on Tisha B'Av morning. Right? And you hear the wheels in the Abarbanel's heads turning, right? The Abarbanel, who sees, either he writes this right before the expulsion, right after the expulsion, but he's living this disintegration and destruction of, he's living this Holocaust that happens in Spain, right? So he says, it's like ki tolid banim ubenei banim v'hishchatetem ve'asitem eso, right, etc. Right? This idea is she'ein ze mitzvah. It's obviously not a mitzvah. This language of ki tolid banim ubenei banim is not a mitzvah that you should have children, and those children should go awry, and then you're going to be expelled from your land. And he's saying it's the same thing here. The language of when you come to the land and you do all of these things are a recipe for trouble. having a king for the Abarbanel is a recipe for trouble. And it's a very, very poignant kind of approach that he sees the whole episode of wanting a king as a cautionary tale. Now, what's particularly fascinating about the Abarbanel, though, is if you study the Abarbanel in Sefer Shmuel, and we'll just kind of take a little taste when we get into the appointment of Shaul, he believes that Shaul was the perfect candidate until he went wrong, right? As far as the Abarbanel in Sefer Shmuel is concerned, Shaul was the right candidate. He went wrong and the people went wrong. But in terms of appointing a king, the people did it right. Shmuel did it right. It was set up for success until it failed, which again is almost like doubly catastrophic. What's fascinating, though, is the idea that we're going to do this in a second, of the Ramban, that whereas the Ramban feels that having a king is in fact a mitzvah, Shaul as king was what was wrong, which we're going to get into in a couple minutes, and then that begs as a whole other stream of theological type of questions, right? So I'm just going to summarize for a second here what's going on. We have a three-way machloket whether we should have a king, right? One is the Rambam, who says it is out, not a mitzvah. Two is the Ramban, who says it's a mitzvah once we ask for it, then it becomes a mitzvah. And the Abarbanel, who's like, nope, it's not a mitzvah, it's a reshut, it's permissible, it's not a command. And as a matter of fact, it's a bad idea. So given this, the question becomes now, who can be king? Right? Who is going to be this king that God will choose? And we very famously default always to the bracha of Yaakov, right? Back in Sefer Bereshit, or at least the final will and testament that he gives his son. And if the pasuk in Sefer Bereshit, the book of Bereshit, chapter 49, verse 10, right? When he's talking to Yehuda and he says, Lo yasur shevet mi Yehuda umechokek mi ben raglav. The staff shall not depart from Yehuda, and the law from between his legs. And from here, the Gemara and the Midrashim all learn that really kingship is supposed to come from the tribe of Yehuda. Question now arises, what's up with Shaul? Right? And here, before we get into the Ramban, I'm going to jump ahead now into Sefer Shmuel. Right? We're in Shmuel Aleph, chapter 9, Perek Tet. At the end of Perek Tet, the people have asked for a king. The people want a king like all of the other nations have a king. The people want a king because they don't see Shmuel's sons being appropriate leaders for them. Shmuel is unhappy. God comes to Shmuel and he says to him, they are not rebelling against you. This is not personal against you. They're rebelling against me. Right? And again, we've got this whole theological question. So Perek Tet begins, Vayehi ish mi ben Yamin, mi Binyamin, ushmo Kish ben Abiel, ben Tzor, ben Bechorah, ben Afiach, ben Ish Yemini, Gibor Chayil. We meet Kish, who is from Binyamin. He is from the tribe of Benjamin, and his name is Kish, and Kish is the son of Abiel, the son of Tzor, yada, 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 yada. He is an Ish Yemini, which either it means he is a Benjaminite, but it could also mean that he is a righteous man. He is a man of integrity, is a man of strength. Gibor Chayil, and he is described here as a man of substance. Another great translation. Gibor Chayil, we typically think of as somebody being physically strong, but we know from Parashat Yitro, which we just read a couple of weeks ago, and we also know obviously from Sefer Mishlei, from Eshet Chayil, which many people have the minhag to say, the custom to say Friday night, that the word Chayil here doesn't just mean physical strength, it means mental strength, emotional strength, financial strength, strength of integrity, strength of character. right? The word chayil is this idea of kind of the total package. We're not just talking about a muscle. This man, Kish, and we're going to go back to these psukim, he had a son, and the son's name was Shaul. And we're going to get to this pasuk in a few minutes. We're now moving into section 2 here, but the question becomes, we know that Shaul is going to be king, and yet Shaul comes from Binyamin. How can this be? So the Ramban in Sefer Bereshit raises this question, and he suggests the following. It says, Sarich, I'm sorry, Dibor Matchot, Chil lo yasur shevet Yehuda, The inyan Shaul haya, and the issue concerning Shaul was, Ki ba'avur shedavar she'elat ha'malchut be'et hahi nit'av etzel hakadosh baruch hu. Because the whole issue of the way Bnei Israel requested a king was disgusting. I think that's really a good way to translate the word, right? It was severely displeasing to God. She'amar, etein lecha melech be'api ve'akach be'evrati, right? This is a quote from Hosea, but it's like, I'll give you a king in my anger, right? You want a king? Fine, I'll give you a king, right? That's God's way of, the way it's going on here, right? You want a king when it's not appropriate. You want a king, you've been rude to my Navi, which means you've been rude to me. You've rejected my Navi, which means you've rejected me. You don't trust me to lead you into battle. You don't trust me to be your leader and to ensure your political success, your military success, your judicial success. You don't want me. You want a king. You want a flesh and blood human being. Fine, I'll give you a flesh and blood human being. So what did he do? Nitnu lo shelo kirtzono, right? He gave them a king that was a setup, that was destined in a way to fail. Velachein lakho be'evrato, right? He took a king in his anger. Sheneharag hu banav upaska v'nifsaka mimenu hamalchut, right? So Shaul, according to the Ramban, and again, the Ramban here is very consistent in his explanations, goes through this in other places as well, is that the reason Shaul became king was because Shaul would not last as king. You want a king? I'm going to give you a king, but I'm going to give you a king that's not going to work. And you're going to hopefully learn from that first outing with a king, aka Shaul, what it really means to have a king, what it means to be a Jewish nation with a monarch. Now, there are a lot of philosophical questions here, which I'm actually not going to go into. Interestingly, the Ramban, and he makes this clear in his discussion around Paro and hardening Paro's heart, is not particularly troubled about the idea of Shaul being, quote unquote, sacrificed on the altar of God's master plan. It's just not something that bothers the Ramban. And again, Shaul does make his mistakes, right? Shaul is not innocent in his own demise, but he does seem to say that this was a monarchy that wasn't going to work. And this is possibly why Shaul is as enraged as he is all the time, is he knows it's not going to work. Very famously, he says to Yonatan, right, in the Haftarah, in the reading from Sefer Shmuel that we typically read when Shabbat is Erev Rosh Chodesh, he says to his son Yonatan, don't you know that this man is going to replace you? And don't you know that David is destined to be king? And if he's going to be king, that means you're not. And that means inevitably that our legacy, our kingship is going to be doomed. Now, interestingly here, there are some Mefarshim who say that that didn't necessarily have to be, that David could have been Kiviyachol, right, the Mashiach ben David, that he could have been the over-king, and the family of Shaul, Yonatan, and Yonatan's descendants could have had some kind of assistant position, right, a Mishneh Lamelech. But again, that's a whole different discussion. Okay. let's go into why Shaul was therefore, if it's supposed to be somebody from David, why is it specifically Shaul? I'm going to go back into Shmuel Perek Tet, right? And we're going to look at, for a few minutes, at both the national reason, the reason kind of for healing of the nation. In other words, why somebody specifically from Shevet Binyamin was picked, and why specifically Shaul. So a little bit of a backstory, just to refresh people's memory. One of the darkest moments in our early history as a people is the story of Pilegesh Begiv'ah. When the people of Shevet Binyamin, this is a story that happens at the end of Sefer Shoftim, the end of the book of Judges, where the people of Shevet Binyamin basically behave the same way as the people of Sodom. It is a horrible incident, and it involves rape and murder and horrible ben adam l'chavero midot, very, complete absence of hospitality, everything that you would not expect from Jews, right, from Bnei Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, comes to pass. As a result, there's a civil war of the 10 tribes against Shevet Binyamin. There are 3 battles. 2 of those battles, Shevet Binyamin win. Now, by the way, I happen to live geographically in the area where this whole story takes place, right? And I can tell you it's a very hilly area. There are lots of hills, there are lots of valleys. It's not easy terrain to wage war in. And if you don't know your way around, it's hard to navigate. So it's not so difficult to understand why the locals would have an advantage. By the way, it's the same thing about why the Hashmonaim eventually won all of their battles, because they knew the terrain and they knew how to use the terrain to their advantage. In any case, you had these 2 battles, and Binyamin won. And finally, in the 3rd battle, the other 10 tribes won, to the extent that they almost wiped out the entire tribe. According to some accounts in Sefer Shoftim, there were 300 men left of Shevet Binyamin. And then there was a whole question of who could marry into Shevet Binyamin, and lots of concomitant information. But what's going into the story of Shaul becoming king, what's going into the backstory of the beginning of Sefer Shmuel, open parentheses, the very first verses of Sefer Shmuel seem to pick up where Sefer Shoftim ends, is this story of Pilegesh Begiv'ah. The story of the Pilegesh Begiv'ah is something that shadows us and our cultural and national psyche all the way through Bayit Rishon. It's something that many of the Nevi'im Achronim, Hosea, Amos, Micha, anytime you hear this word Giv'ah, you're going to start thinking about Pilegesh Begiv'ah. It's one of these catchwords. It's a cultural catchword. So the fact that somebody from Shevet Binyamin, probably not more than 1 or 2 generations removed from this episode, is the father of the king, is something very telling. And it's likely specifically to unify and heal the people that Shaul has chosen. Right? This man whose name is Kish, he is the son of somebody named Abiel. And Abiel, right, name tells us everything we need to know about him, right? My father is God. And there's an interesting conversation in the Gemara about who this Abiel actually is, because in Sefer Divrei Hayamim, in the book of Chronicles, which we're about to finish in our 929, Kish is mentioned as the son of Ner, right? Avner, right? And Kish are actually brothers. I'm sorry, Avner is Kish's, yes, Avner and Kish are brothers. In other words, Avner, the general of Shaul's army, is his uncle. And Ner is both Kish and Avner's father. What does it mean that Abiel's name actually was Ner? So the Gemara mentions that what Ner, aka Abiel, used to do is he would be responsible for making sure that dark alleyways were lit. Right? And again, all of this story of Pilegesh Begiva and the absence of hospitality and the horrific treatment of strangers, right? And how Ner, that's his name, whose name is also Abiel, stands in stark contrast as somebody who provides light, literally, metaphorically, for other people in dark places, literally and metaphorically. Right? It therefore should not come as any surprise to us that his son, who is Kish, and Kish's son, who is then Shaul, becomes the one who is chosen. Shaul himself is described as in numbers of ways. He is described first of all as a Bachur. And again, here his name was Shaul, an excellent young man, right? So Bachur here could either mean he is physically young, or Bachur here could mean he's a Bachur, he's a guy, right? He is that charismatic, tall, handsome, in his prime young man. He is Tov. And again, anytime we see that word Tov in Tanakh, we are thrown back, number one, to Moshe, but Tere Otoki Tofu. She sees that he is Tov, and Tov takes us all the way back to Breshit, and that first day of Breshit, right? Vayar Elohim ki Tov, right? Vayar, God saw the light, that first light of creation, that it was Tov. And the word Tov means perfect. It means done. It means just as God intended it to be. The word Tov from Perek Aleph of Sefer Breshit does not mean the same thing as Tov comes to mean later after eating from the Eitz Hadat, Tov V'Ra. Tov also has the sense of being pure and perfect. The Rashbam says about Moshe that he was born perfect, right? Because every mother thinks that their child is cute and pretty and good. Right? But Tov here, so when it's talking about Shaul, it means that he was exactly as God had intended. The Ein Ish mi Bnei Yisrael Tov mimenu. There's nobody in Bnei Yisrael that was more good, that was more pure, that was more perfect, that was a greater tzaddik, that was more appropriate to be king than he. Mishichmo v'mala gavoa mikol ha'am. He was literally from his shoulders and up. He was taller than everybody else. And again, all of this is both literal and metaphorical, right? He is taller physically. He stands out in a room. He stands out in a crowd, but his integrity is also taller. His head is higher than everybody else. His head, his mind, his brain, his eyes. Now, what that also could mean is that his head and his heart were a little bit further apart than other people's heads and hearts. And that also kind of leads us places. I want to go into the Abarbanel here. Sorry. Yeah, don't mean to make you guys dizzy. Right, and the Abarbanel tells us straight out. And the Abarbanel says basically there are 4 reasons why Shaul became king. Reason number 1, right? Ha'achat lihiyot kish ibor chayil, because of his father, right? Because of his lineage. Right, that he comes from this family, right? That he comes from Michalatzav, Ish Yoshev al Kisei Yisrael, Kedei Sheyeh Rav Lahoshia, right? That he comes from this illustrious family, that he comes from a man who kind of serves his people, and serves his people by lighting their path and guiding them. Right. The next reason the Abarbanel says, Lefi Shahaya Sam Oto Bachur Shaul, right? That he was handsome, he was good looking, right? Velachein lekachto ha'el yitbarach lemelech laha'ir shegam b'malchuto. Scrolling down, yeh Shaul ki lo yatmid. Did I just skip something? Yeah, nope. Right, that he is handsome and he is good looking. And then the Abarbanel continues, and somehow this got lost, and I apologize. I'm just going to go back into the text. It says, first of all, he comes from an illustrious family. Second of all, he's handsome. Third of all, he is spiritually pure. And fourth of all, because he is a leader. The way that Abarbanel explains Shechmo v'mala gavo mikol ha'am is that his leadership potential was greater than anybody else's. Is that Shaul had everything it took to be a leader. Now, interestingly, right, the tov and the leadership, right, the ein ish b'mnei Yisrael tov mimenu, sounds very Moshe-like, but it's like almost like you could say like he's better than Moshe, not better than Moshe spiritually, but more appropriate for leadership. Moshe, in a way, is kind of an anti-leader, that he's the anti-hero. He doesn't speak fluidly. He hasn't lived in amongst diplomats. He's not necessarily an easy person to like. He's very strict, right? It's Aaron who's the nice guy. It's kind of as if Shaul is this combination of Yosef and Yehuda and Aaron and Moshe, right? So it's Yosef and Yehuda and Levi and Binyamin, right? All like taking the best from many of the tribes and smushing it together in one package. Moving right along. Okay. So let's look for a minute at Shmuel and Shaul's first encounter. I'm going to scroll through here. We have this very interesting episode of Shaul going in search of his father's lost donkeys, right? But we have a donkey, and we have a father, and we have a son, and we have a servant. Okay, so I hope that some of the, illusion bells in your head are starting to ring. And what's really important to remember when learning Navi is Navi was written to be heard. It wasn't written as a text to be read in the same way that Torah, that Chumash, is meant to be read and darshaned and like the crown of every letter. But when Navi'im, and Ketuvim are written down, it's written down in a way so that we should hear it and we should start thinking, wait a minute, father, son, Na'ar, donkey, quest, finding the man of God, finding God, right? So that again, this illusion of Shaul almost as Abraham and Yitzchak put together, but he's going off in the service of his father, right? He does what his father asks him to do, and he gets to Har Ephraim, and he goes all over the place. I can tell you as somebody who's living here, the distances that he traversed on foot and the ups and the downs and the mountains was insane. Miles and miles and miles of terrain. He's going to look for these donkeys. The degree of kibud av that he has is incredible. And he goes and he's looking for these donkeys, and he's looking at his donkeys, and he finally gets to the point, he says to his nar, says, you know what, we need to go back, because at this point, my father is going to be more worried about us than he is about the donkeys. Right? Again, kibud av here. And then the Na'ar says to him, Vayomelo, Hinena ish Elohim be'ir hazot, right? That this is the Na'ar talking. He's talking to Shaul. Now, Shaul, we learn later, he and his family are very, very, very wealthy. They're a very large cattle owning family, right? So the fact that the Na'ar feels comfortable speaking to him is in and of itself says something about Shaul's personality. And he says, let's go to the Nabi. Atan el Chasham, let's go. Maybe he can tell us where our donkeys went. Vayomer Shaul Na'aro. Shaul talks to his Na'ar and he says, V'hinei nelech, let us go. It's one thing for the Na'ar to say to Shaul, that language of let us. But now it's Shaul talking to the Na'ar and saying, let us. And the Mefarshim here make a very big deal out of this. The fact that Shaul not only has tremendous kibud av, but that his ben adam lechavero here is so finely tuned that he treats his Na'ar as a respected partner. And then he says, Umana vila ish, right? But what can we bring to the Navi? We don't have anything in our hands anymore to give him. So he has respect for his father, respect for his Na'ar, respect for the Navi, right? He is this incredibly respectful person. So they go to Shmuel, story goes on. Shmuel says to them, you're going to find your donkeys and more. I'm going to go back to our source sheet, and we're wrapping up here, okay? And Shmuel tells Shaul, you are going to be king. And now we find ourselves in Perek Yud of Sefer Shmuel. A second. I seem to have lost chapter 10. Okay, we're just going to scroll until we get there. I apologize. You can close your eyes for a second if I'm making you dizzy, sorry. Very momentous meeting. Okay. Here. Okay, here we are in chapter 10. Vayikach Shmuel et pach Hashem, and he takes this jar of oil. And by the way, here, the Gemara and the Mefarshim say what's up with the fact that it's a jar. And this is another bit of an allusion to the fact that the kingship is supposed to be temporary, because jars can be broken, and David is anointed with the horn of a ram, and that's something that can't be broken so easily. Also, this is man-made, and the horn is a natural thing, and it's God-made. And he says to him, you, hello, ki mashtacha Hashem al nachlaton v'nagid. And again, this word hello is a little bit of a troubling word, although Sepharia says to him, the Lord has anointed you ruler. Right? Has herewith, translates the word hello as herewith. Again, it's a little bit of a difficult translation. And Shmuel gives Shaul 3 signs to show that what he is saying is in fact true. Sign number 1 is that you are going to meet 2 people who are going to tell you that the donkeys have been found. Sign number 2 is you're going to meet 3 people, and they're going to be carrying with them wine and bread, and I forgot what the third thing is. No say shloshet, right? Wine, bread, and sheep. And then the last sign, and this is the really important one, is as follows. You're going to get to, after you meet them, you're going to get to a place called Givat HaElohim, Asher Sham Nitzivei Plishtim, tons and tons of foreshadowing happening here. Vayibevoacha Sham Ha'ir Upagat B'Chevel Nevi'im. You're going to literally bump into a group of Nevi'im, and these Nevi'im are going to be coming down from their surface, from the Bama. V'lifnehem Nevel, they'll have instruments, they'll have stringed instruments and drums and flutes and some other kind of instrument, and they are going to be in the process of prophesying. Ve'alta alecha ruach, ve'tzalcha alecha ruach Hashem, the Spirit of God will come down and overtake you. V'hit nabeta, please note the missing aleph here, and you will prophesy with them. V'nehefachta le'ish acher, and you will become another person. And I believe that it is really this pasuk where Shaul's life and personality are changed. He becomes the king. He's a reluctant king. I'm going to wrap up here because I see we're already after 6, but if you read these verses in chapter 10, 22 to 20 to 23, Shaul is literally hiding. He has to kind of be dragged out from the baggage area when it comes to anointing. He doesn't want to be king. But once he becomes king in the next chapter, in chapter 11, and in chapter 12 and 13 and 14 and 15, he gives himself totally to the defense and well-being and leadership of his people. And if anything, you could say that that's probably his tragic flaw, is that he is so much interested in being the best people's king that he loses sight a little bit of this pasuk that we started off with in Sefer Dvarim, right? That Som tasim alecha melech asher yivchar Hashem Elokecha, right? That it's God who's doing it. And then rak lo yarbelo susim, etc. Right? These aren't Shaul's flaws. These aren't Shaul's flaws. והיה כשבתו על כיסא מלכות וכתב לו את משנה התורה הזאת על ספר לפני הכהנים והלוויים, והייתה עמו וקרא בו כל ימי חייו, למען ילמד ויראה את השם אלוקיו. Right? The function of a king is to serve God. And that's where Shaul fell short. One could say that it is that if every other human has to observe the commands ben adam lechavero first and foremost, and then the mitzvot ben adam lemakom, obviously they're, can't say that they're not important, but we see God will forgive things that we do against him, but God won't forgive things that we do against one another. With a king, it's flipped. Only with a king, by the way. Shaul's crimes cost him the crown. David's crimes don't, because David's crimes are personal crimes. Not that they aren't heinous, not that they don't cost him. They cost him 4 children, right? They cost him, but they don't cost him the throne. They don't cost him the kingship. Shaul's crimes, which is that he doesn't wait for Shmuel and he doesn't kill the king of Amalek and he allows the people to take the sheep of Amalek. Those are crimes against God, and that's what costs him the Melucha. What costs Shaul his sanity, though, right, is the fact that he does know what it means to be a Navi. And he is a tzaddik, and he is so finely tuned, and he is so perfect, and he is so pure that he knows what he's lost, and he knows that he can't regain it. He is that tov of Bereshit. He is that kind of that perspective of the world that's black and white, binary, light and dark. And he knows that light is God and dark is the absence of God. And he knows that when Shmuel abandons him in chapter 15, right, that the light of God is abandoning him as well. And that's what makes him crazy. That's when he starts to lose his mind. And you can see the rest of Sefer Shmuel in that light. Everything that happens with Shaul as his life goes on is because he knows. He knows what was, he knows what could have been, he knows what he's missing. To some degree, you could even say he knows what will be, and that's what drives him literally to madness. I just want to kind of bring the whole thing together, and then I'll open it up for questions here, right? That we have this idea of a king that is theologically problematic and psychologically challenging, right? Leadership is a very, very, very challenging kind of a thing. And it takes a very unique individual to be a leader. What's fascinating is that by the time we get to Shlomo, kings don't have prophecy anymore. It seems that one person cannot do it all, right? Moshe cannot be father, husband, Navi, monarch. Something has to give. Shmuel doesn't seem to succeed in raising his children because he's busy leading the nation. Shaul becomes the people's king and as a result loses his connection with God. David comes about as close as we can get. And yet, again, he has plenty of problems, family problems. By the time we get to Shlomo, it's like no more nevuah for kings. Nevuah for kings just doesn't work out so well. It's a challenging thing, this idea of monarchy. Leadership is hard. Leadership is challenging. If you listen to the Nabi, listen to the word of God, you're in good hands. When you don't, you start running into trouble. I'm going to stop here. I'm going to stop, and I'm also going to stop the screen share, and I'm going to open it up for questions and comments and thoughts. So please feel free to unmute yourself if you've got a question or a comment or a thought.
Actually, I have a question.
Go for it.
I guess I'm not really too familiar with that thing you were referring to, Giva. But again, it was, if I understand correctly, Pilagesh ba Giva. So can you describe?
Pilegesh is a concubine, and Giva was the name of a place. The story of Pilegesh ba Giva is a story at the end of the book of Judges. It's chapter 19, 20, and 21. It's a really horrible episode in our national history, which, as I said, involves horrifically poor and absent hospitality, rape, murder, war. Very R-rated story. And it sounds much more like it should be happening in Sodom than happening in Israel. And it's, it said it casts a huge pall, both at the time, but really for hundreds and hundreds of years to come. It's very much a national travesty.
Oh, I'm sorry. What's the time period for that?
The time period is the end of this time period of the Judges. It's that time period at the kind of right before Shmuel, right before Samuel is born. I would say we're dealing, probably about 80 years before Shaul becomes king. Right? So we're talking like two generations prior. But it's really important to know that backstory to understand really the rest of Nevi'im, both Nevi'im Rishonim and Nevi'im Achronim, right? That to really kind of get what's going on. And there are a lot of literary references made to that story, but particularly the fact that Shaul comes from the tribe that was implicated, not just implicated, directly responsible for that whole incident is very important. Does that answer your question?
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions, comments?
Could you expand a little bit on this notion of Shaul having received Nivuah and how that played itself out?
So in one of the three signs, the third of the three signs that Shmuel gives to Shaul is that you will meet up with prophets and receive prophecy. And that prophecy is explained by the commentaries as basically being imbued with the Spirit of God as a way of channeling strength and righteousness, particularly when it comes to battle, and particularly when it comes to battling the Plishtim, the Philistines, and then later also the Amalekim. But a lot of the commentaries discuss the fact that basically once you're a prophet, it's kind of like once that door has been opened, then you never forget that experience. You never lose that experience, because it's like, it's like a hit of cocaine, or kind of being able to wear the most pure and expensive perfume, right? That sensory experience, both on a physical level, but on a neurological level, and also on obviously a spiritual level, is an experience that changes you forever. And once you've had it and then you lose it, it's horrible, because you know what you had, and you know that you can never have it again, and you know that it's your fault that you can never have it again. And that sense of helplessness and powerlessness is in fact what enrages Shaul. And it talks about how a ruach ra'ah enters him, and the Ruah, Ra being the opposite of Tov and darkness being the opposite of light, that it's not a spirit of evil in the sense of doing evil. It's that absence of Tov, that absence of purity that makes Shaul completely crazy. That's what drives his mania, his depression, his paranoia, because he knows what he's lost, and he likely also knows that David is going to be the next king, possibly before David himself knows. So all of that just really, really messes with his mind and with his soul. And that's why in the end, he never kills David, and why he loves David, and why you have these scenes where he's like crying over the fact of how much he loves David when 10 seconds earlier he wanted to murder him. He's crazed. He's really crazed. Does that answer your question somewhat?
Yes. Sybil's nodding, so I think so. Any additional questions?
I just want to, Zoe, I just want to throw this out, that if people have questions and they don't feel like they want to talk in a public forum, you can, if anybody has questions, comments, thoughts, please email Zoe, and then Zoe, you can absolutely forward them to me and I can address them in writing, or we can set up a time to chat and you can share my WhatsApp information, all of that.
Thank you so much. A very generous offer for any additional questions you have. So I think we will call it for today. Thank you very much for being here for our first Israeli Speaker Series speaker. And I hope that all of you took some new insights about King Saul and this very complex and complicated figure. And I hope that you can join us for another Mayan event soon. Please look at our website for what is coming up. And feel free to email me if you have any questions. And I hope that you all have a great day as we navigate all this snow. So have a good day, everyone.
Have a good day, and thank you very much, Zoe, and thank you all for coming. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure. Thank you.